Tourism season in Florida, Mexico, and the Caribbean is facing a huge threat, a gigantic blob of smelly seaweed floating in the Atlantic, and it's washing up on beaches in the region. Leila Santiago shows us how the Florida shores are already being impacted.
It's thick in the summertime, builds up and smells terrible.
Joe Kaplan captured these images about a week ago. Massive amounts of seaweed washing up at Smathers Beach, a beach he knows well because he walks it several times a week.
I was shocked when I saw it that day where it wasn't even spring yet. It's still winter, which is very unusual.
And this is about 5,000 miles long.
Professor Schauman, who is one of the leading experts on what many have referred to as a massive blob of seaweed heading to Florida's coast.
Fair to call it a blob?
Nope.
No, we can't call it a blob. Okay.
I would never call that a blob.
Okay, why?
Because it's not.
Satellite images, he says, show it's not one massive body of seaweed, rather a bunch of patchy clumps traveling from West Africa. It's called the Atlantic Sargassum Belt and is considered a natural phenomenon. Right now, it's twice the width of the U.S., carrying 6 million tons of seaweed and headed to the East Coast.
In June of this year, it may turn into 20 million tons.
So let me get this straight. This, what we're seeing the last month, is 6 million tons, and it's going to get bigger.
Yes, there's no way to stop that. This is nature, just like no one can stop a hurricane.
Should we be worried about that?
Nope.
Why?
The reason is the sargassum is not toxic.
But it smells pretty bad, and it's a nuisance for those trying to keep beaches clean to attract tourists. Just a few years ago, here's what it looked like in Mexico. Officials in Monroe County, which includes the Florida Keys, have set aside more than $200,000 to clean and remove sargassum from its beaches.
Seaweed is a mixed blessing. We need it. Seaweed is a nursery for all these large pelagic fish. The negative side to that seaweed is if it comes in the concentrations that are believed we're going to see, our fishing grounds are going to be completely covered with it. There's almost no point to fishing because we're going to be spending the entire day cleaning weed off our lines.
And as the Sargassum Belt heads toward Florida, another natural phenomenon is already hitting its beaches on the West Coast, red tide. It can be toxic, kill fish, and cause respiratory issues. This year's red tide concerns were enough to cancel at least one major event here in Indian Rocks, where one family visiting told us,
as soon as my son and my husband and I got out of our car, we all started coughing.
But for spring breakers like this group from Iowa, the concerns of massive amounts of seaweed or red tide were not enough to change vacation plans.
I would rather it be red tide than raining every day.
Brian LaPointe is a research professor at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, and he joins me now from Fort Pierce in Florida. Appreciate you being with us.
Well, thank you for the invite.
So, a massive blob of seaweed spanning 5,000 miles is heading straight for the Florida Gulf Coast, so vast, in fact, that it can be seen from space. When do you expect it to hit the coast? And what might this signal for the critical spring break and, of course, the summer months ahead?
Well, the so-called blob of seaweed is this seaweed floating sargassum in the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And that is what we call the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. And that sargassum seaweed is moving towards the west and will proceed to move through the Caribbean and up into the Gulf of Mexico and South Florida area in the coming months. And we typically get the peak of that seaweed arriving in Florida around midsummer. July is usually when it peaks.
Yeah, I think I've been there when it's arrived. So why are we seeing such a massive blob of seaweed at this time? What's causing it? And how big a threat does it pose to residents and to sea life?
Well, this is an unusual year in that this sargassum bloom in the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt started early. It doubled in size between December and January. In 1 month, it doubled in size and was larger in January than it has ever been since this new region of sargassum growth began in 2011. So this is an entirely new oceanographic phenomenon. Previously, the Sargasso was in the Sargasso Sea to the north. That is the central gyre of the North Atlantic Ocean, and would circulate in the currents around that, as well as through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a whole new thing. And this is the source of this sargassum seaweed that is creating such a problem, really a catastrophic problem for tourism in the Caribbean region, where it piles up on beaches up to 5 or 6 feet deep on the beaches in some places. In fact, in Barbados, just last week, they reported they need 1,600 dump trucks a day to clean the beaches of this seaweed to make it suitable for tourists and recreation on the beaches. And, you know, where it comes ashore in the mangroves, it comes in such large quantities that it basically sucks the oxygen out of the water and creates what we refer to as dead zones. These are normally nursery habitats for fisheries, and you know, once they're devoid of oxygen, we have lost that habitat.
Right.
They are also harmful to seagrasses and coral reefs, and obviously to human health as well, because when they rot, they release toxic hydrogen sulfide gas. They have a high concentration of arsenic in the tissue. So you have to be very careful when you clean the beaches and try to reuse this for fertilizers or some other beneficial use.
So what solutions are available to stop these massive seaweed invasions? Is there anything that can be done to disperse or break it up, or do we just need to do what you've suggested, basically taking away truckloads of this seaweed?
Well, at this point, that's all we can do. Efforts are being made in the Caribbean to construct booms, to hold it off the beach, and to get harvesting boats to run along those booms and harvest it into barges, where then it could be taken either to land to a suitable disposal site and dried and perhaps used for some purpose, or a new project is looking at actually harvesting it at sea and sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. And in that way, sequestering carbon that is, you know, used by photosynthesis in the seaweed, sending it to the bottom of the sea where it will be buried, and in that way sequester that carbon to kind of chip away at the CO2 buildup in the atmosphere.
Brian Lapointe, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.